So cogency, the conclusion still follows from the premises, but it only follows some sort of 51 to 99%, right? So validity is 100% the conclusion follows. Cogency is it follows 51 to 99%. And then ill-formed is the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises at all. So all senators are ambitious. John McCain lives in Arizona. Therefore, John McCain is ambitious, right? Well, none of my premises told me that John McCain is a senator. It just said that John McCain lives in Arizona. So the conclusion has nothing does not follow from those premises, and that's going to be an ill-formed argument. Steps of argument evaluation, there's the chart, right? So you ask if it's valid, yes or no. Yes, if it's cogent. You check on the reasonableness of the premises, and you check on whether it has defeaters. Ethics / morality, oh, well, this is just a repeat question, I suppose, right? Those are synonyms. Legal-ought, prudential-ought, moral-ought, chess-ought, etc., right? So the claim here is that there's lots of authorities, right? There's lots of sources where people are, things or institutions or people are making claims about what I should or ought to, right? Making normative claims on me, normative demands on me, right? The law is one of them. It says that legally I ought not to speed. Legally I ought not to do drugs. Legally I ought not to, a number of other things. Legally I am permitted to break a promise to a friend, sleep around on a spouse, right? So legally, we think that morality is different than law, right? And those are sort of cases that kind of nicely illustrate the difference. The moral ought, like morally, I ought not to break a promise to a friend, but legally, I'm permitted to, right? Legally, there's no ought, not, so we can see that the moral ought and the legal ought are different. Prudential ought, that's your long-term interest, right? So I say it's prudent of you to quit smoking. It's prudent of you to put money in your savings account. So prudentially, you ought to quit smoking, or prudentially, you ought to open up a savings account. There's the moral ought, the chess ought. So there's also a whole bunch of other oughts, right? Any sort of game is going to have its set of rules. So I say, in the game of chess, you should not move your pawn that way, right? So if you move your pawn 4 spaces in the opening move, I say you ought not to do that, right? And I'm not saying morally you ought not to do that, or legally you ought not to do that, or prudentially. I'm just saying, chess, the rules of chess prohibit that move, or the rules of tennis prohibit a move, or so there's lots of different oughts, right? There's lots of different types of normative claims. And of course, we're interested in the claim, if morality exists, it would be independent of legal oughts and prudential oughts and selfish oughts and chess oughts. It would be this separate source of authority, this separate set of oughts that come from somewhere else. And the utilitarians think it comes from the existence of pleasure and suffering. And Aristotle thinks it comes from the functions of man and what makes a good human life. And Kant thinks it comes from reason itself, that reason makes demands on how we should act. So all I want to do with having that on the review is to differentiate, to remember that the legal ought and the moral ought are different, for example. So just because legally you ought to do something doesn't mean you should morally do it. And just because you morally should do it doesn't mean you should legally do it, right? I might even have a societal ought on here, something like what people will give you bad looks for if you do. So socially, you ought not to refuse to shake someone's hand when you first meet them. And then lastly, there's the difference between honoring value and maximizing value. So this is a difference between the Kantians and the utilitarians mainly. The utilitarians think, well, if pleasure is good, I have to make sure there's as much of it as possible, right? And the Kantians don't think that that's the right response to value, right? They want to say that free choice is valuable, but they don't think that we need to go out and breed as many people as possible or make sure I make as many choices as possible. Their claim is something like to honor a value is to not, if something's valuable, you don't try maximizing it. You try to respect it or honor it in such a way that I don't violate your choices. I try to get to your consent if I need you to help me do something. It's something on the lines of not frustrating your choices or treating your choices as worthless in the pursuit of my own choices. So for Kant, honoring value, so that again, with I'll use this barber example. So if I need to go get a haircut, and I might have to, the what I would do is I'd go to the barber, and I'm not going to stick a gun to his head and say, "Give me a haircut," right? In that case, I would not be honoring the value of his. The Kantian's going to say his free choices, his capacity to make a free choice has value, and I need to honor that value by getting him to freely consent to give me the haircut. So I'm going to give him $1 and say, "Is that enough? Here's another dollar," and I'll just keep handing him money until I can get him to freely consent to give me a haircut, or I'll go somewhere else to try finding somebody who I can get to freely consent to give me a haircut. So in that case, I'm not only trying to get a haircut, I'm also trying to get his consent. And that's sort of the Kantian idea of not using people, of treating people's choices as valuable in addition to my other goals. So when I'm pursuing my other goals, which I have chosen, and that's why I see them valuable, I also have to see other people's choices as valuable and make sure that I'm not violating them in the pursuit of my own goals. And so that's what honoring value for Kant is, right? He's not telling us to breed lots of little choice makers, as many as possible, to make sure there's as many choice makers in the world as possible. Another good case would be something like, killing some people, breaking lots of promises, killing a whole bunch of innocent people in order to save a whole bunch of other people, right? In that case, I think Kant's going to say if I had to kill 2 people to save 5, right? Two innocent people to save 5, executing them. I think that Kant would say I'm not allowed to do that. The utilitarian who's trying to maximize value, let's say that I thought that the right response to value was to maximize the number of free choice makers there are in the world, the number of humans in the world. In that case, I would kill the 2 to save the 5. Kant thinks that that's wrong, right? It's honoring the value, not trying to maximize the number. So that's another big difference between the utilitarians. Not only do the utilitarians and the Kantians disagree about what's of value, where the Kantian thinks that free choice is value and the utilitarian thinks that pleasure is valuable, but they also disagree about the right response to value. The Kantian thinks that it's to honor it or respect it. I'm not quite sure what word I want to use. Whereas the utilitarian thinks it's just maximizing, right? Trying to make sure there's as much of that valuable thing there in the world as possible. And I believe that's the whole review. So good luck. I'll see you guys at the online talk session and on the web discussion forum.